The American Revolutions and its Changes and Continuities, a Raoul and Jeremy production. International relations in America before the turning point. Now, before the turning point, America had great relations with England. They even fought alongside British troops in the French and Indian War. However, this war was very expensive, and they had to brunt the cost for it. They had to stop trading with other countries and were taxed heavily by England, and the colonists were angered by this because they were being taxed without any representation. Now I'd like to talk about national identity before the turning point. Now, the American colonies saw themselves as being British loyal subjects. While they did rule themselves and have direct government, they were loyalists to the crown. While they also did want to see their own parliament, seeing as they thought parliament was incompetent, they still saw themselves as colonies and they were under the power of King George.
Diplomacy before the turning point. So, overall, the colonists were very lenient. They still weren't anything radical. The Stamp Act Congress was created after the creation of the Stamp Act. They wrote to the king speaking about how unfair the taxation without representation was. So as you can see, they still didn't want to separate from England, but they recognized the wrongdoings that they were committing. This would lead to the Olive Branch petition. So this petition was basically affirming how loyal they still were, because they wrote to the king speaking about their conditions, and they basically wanted to prevent a war. This is the purpose of the Olive Branch petition. And this comes to our turning point. So essentially, King George, he barely looks at the Olive Branch petition, and before tearing it up, he talks to Parliament, and he's allowed to send Boston troops. No, he's allowed to send troops to Boston, and he declares the northern states a part of rebellion that needs to be put down. All the colonists that were loyal now felt a sort of resentment to the king, because they thought he was great and Parliament was the one that was passing all these intolerable acts. So after this, they see themselves as an individual entity, not a part of the British colonies.
Now I'd like to go over the Revolutionary War and 4 of its key battles. Now I'm going to start with Lexington and Concord. Now, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was almost one battle, essentially, seeing as there was only 40 militiamen at Lexington, and they were getting destroyed by the redcoats, so they had to turn tail and run to Concord, where there they were able to hold off the British and push them and make them run back to Boston while they were all being attacked, while the redcoats were being attacked from the hills by other militiamen coming to help the fight. Now, the second battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill, was a very influential battle because it dictated the control of Boston. The Americans were able to hold back the British for 3 waves, but eventually did fall. And many influential quotes come from this battle, like "Don't shoot until you see the white of their eyes," seeing as ammo was limited and guns were very inaccurate. Now, the third most important battle was the Battle of Saratoga. This overall is the most important battle because this was the battle that showed the French that this revolution wasn't something that could easily be snuffed out, and they could see themselves backing this and defeating the British on one front. And finally, we have the Battle of Yorktown, which ended the war overall as a lasting victory for the Americans.
National identity after the turning point. So now they saw themselves as American. They still ruled themselves. They held ideas of direct government. However, many states still were individual. They weren't exactly all in a union. Many states were, some can say, selfish, and eventually that would come back to bite them because they would not be able to form a union only during the time of the Revolutionary War.
international relations after the turning point. They began to establish treaties with other countries, such as France. They also began trading with other countries as they were limited before by their mother country, England, which they did not see as their mother country any longer. Along with this, England was forced to recognize the colonies as their own individual entity, and they couldn't do anything about it.
Diplomacy afterwards included of course, the Declaration of Independence and the treaty alliance with France. After the Americans were able to win the war, John Adams created a peace alliance with Parliament. And afterwards, the Articles of Confederation was created. Um, so now that the colonists created America, they were unsure of they knew what kind of government they wanted. They didn't want a strong government that was included in England. They hoped for a weak government that could secure the rights of the people, and that was not one that could tax the people, that could have a standing army, and that government would eventually lead to something that was completely incompetent.
Now that we've finished our presentation, I'd like to give a brief overview of what we've talked about so far. We've talked about salutary neglect and how England didn't bother with the colonies much for 150 years, how the colonists rose up and said no to taxation without representation from England, how their futile attempt of peace before the war failed utterly and our turning point was made, the Revolutionary War and how the Americans won, and finally how America became a nation.